First of all, I want to thank you for a great conference, Bora and Goran and Gregor and Urban, and especially the Goethe-Institut for hosting me so generously. So I'm sorry to disappoint you at the end of a second thrilling day. I'm neither philosopher nor do I understand that much about Hegel or masters or slaves. However, I know quite something about the talking back against the conditional concept of sovereignty, a talking back from Hegel's female contemporary who died too young for her voice to be heard. So far, I have learned that the master is either necessary, as Slavoj insisted, or ridiculous, hysterical, excessive, undead, colonial, racist, traumatized, creepy, and even castrated, as Peter pointed out. Indeed, that is exactly Karoline von Güderrode's claim. While Hegel theorizes the master, Günderrode stages his castration before Hegel's master is even born. And this staging reveals his imaginary nature. As you know better than I do, the master is not Hegel's invention. It roots most of all in early modern political theory, where sovereignty is mapped on masculinity or even virility. In this tradition, also in Hegel, power and potency of the master are flip sides of the same coin. Art and literature are doing a great job in promoting this alliance. It is Don Juan who serves as a role model for the master. With my talk, I would thus like to draw attention to literature as epistemic object. I consider literature a genuine theoretical media which allows insights long before concepts are at hand. Günderrode thus is a theoretical mistress. Günderrode's counter-discursive strategy of the master is the topic of my talk. In her rather unknown ballad, Don Juan, she attacks the master's masculinity and virility by attacking European idealism and its literary representatives in German classicism. She diagnoses a specific sickness of the master. So what I present for the next 40 minutes is an etiology of the master from a psychoanalytic perspective. By analyzing the ballad, I do not want to reject the concept of master. However, I want to remind that master is always a white, male, heterosexual old man. However, I will show that the master is a whiny little boy. That means a regressive fantasy. Günderrode was born in Karlsruhe in 1780, I think 10 years younger than Hegel, I think, right? And in 1806, she took her own life. She left behind a considerable oeuvre, poems, prose, and letters. Günderrode published the ballad Don Juan in 1804 in the collection Poems and Fantasies, 15 years before Lord Byron's famous poem. That is one maybe some of you know. In contrast to his adaptation of the Don Juan material, as well as many others in European modernism, Günderrode's ballad has been all but forgotten. Everyone associates the name Don Juan with the same thing. He is the dick that picks up all the chicks. Always ready for sex and crime, Don Juan is something like the founding myth of the master, and that means of male sovereignty, potent and powerful. But with her interpretation of the Don Juan material, Günderrode confidently confronts this myth. I would like to demonstrate this in 4 steps that are actually more like an exercise in close reading than a real talk. You find the German original and an English translation of the 2 handouts, if you like. I'll start with the history of the tradition of the myth and then turn to 20th century theory. With this background, I will analyze Günderrode's ballad and try to convince you that Don Juan undertakes a frontal assault on the founding myth of the master. There's been a lot of scholarship on the history of the Don Juan material and motives. From the very beginning, the Don Juan figure has been characterized by a certain ambivalence. Not only is he an erotic, unscrupulous seducer, he's also a clumsy show-off. There may be some prototypes for the Don Juan figure in comic tradition, but he only really appeared at the beginning of the 17th century in Tirso de Molina, and then Molière's comedy made the material acceptable for performing at court in 1665. Finally, Günderrode refers to Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. I will get to this connection later. Don Juan's Northern European brother is Johann Faust. That would be a different lecture, but it underscores what the Don Juan material is all about. It is a founding myth of the master, which goes along with power and potency. The storyline is based on 4 elements. Don Juan desires women, always more than one. Don Juan has rivals. Don Juan has a servant. Don Juan is punished. Don Juan became famous in 1787 through Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's opera The Rake Punished, or Don Giovanni, for which Lorenzo da Ponte wrote the libretto. To sum up its content, in the first act, Don Giovanni seduces 2 ladies and 1 peasant woman, cuckolds 2 husbands, and murders a father, Il Comandantore, the real master, who is remembered with a statue. The plot strings together not only affairs but also intrigues and misadventures in which the servant Leporello faithfully assists his potent master and keeps a record of his seductions. Look at this thick book. It's filled with the names of all his sweethearts. But then comes a morally or theologically motivated turn in the second act. Don Giovanni, who refuses to repent, invites the statue of the murdered master to a candlelight dinner. When he arrives, the stone guest pronounces Don Giovanni's punishment, and the flames of hell engulf him. I could also talk about Mozart, who makes Don Juan a highly ambivalent figure. His potency is ridiculed. The patricide does not make him the master. In the end, Don Juan succumbs to the master, and there's an end to sovereignty. Mozart's modern Don Juan myth has been at the center of the Don Juan boom in modern literature and theory. Søren Kierkegaard views Don Juan as a prototype of the aesthete. From the point of view of the existentialist philosopher Albert Camus, Don Juan's free love led to the liberation of the people in French Revolution. Jacques Lacan evaluates him as a hysteric. Julia Kristeva diagnoses him with objectless love, which means that Don Juan embodies desire in and of itself, the phallus. Soshana Felman ascribes Don Juan's seductive power to the power of language because he does not tell the truth but only makes groundless promises without narration, claims Cornelia Piersdorf. Desire has no media. Really? I'm not prepared to put up with so much abstraction. Instead, I ask myself, where does the energy that the Don Juan figure is charged with in literature and theory come from? How can it be that a rather ridiculous comedic figure has become a tragic figure in the modern age and was seen as a mirror figure of the master macho Faust? Otto Rank provides the answer to these questions. In 1924, his essay, The Don Juan Figure, appeared in the journal Imago, which was edited by the master himself, Sigmund Freud. Rank derives the Don Juan myth from the Oedipus myth, the psychoanalytic meta-myth, as Slavoj has named it. Hamlet, Faust, Don Juan, and other ambivalent tragic heroes in the wake of Oedipus thus form a psychoanalytical paradigm of the master. We all know that the goal of a boy's development is to overcome the Oedipus complex. Then he has successfully identified with the father and has replaced the mother with other women, hence the series in Don Juan. Overcoming the Oedipus complex is thus the precondition for male sovereignty. Only those who are not the father's servants can become masters. In his analysis of Mozart's opera, Rank elaborates how in Don Juan's Oedipus complex the many seduced women represent the one unattainable mother, and the many men who he deceives, fights, and kills represent the father. Don Juan remains loyal to his mother by devaluing women. The father remains his enemy, represented very impressively by the stone guest. He embodies Don Juan's censoring ego ideal, Ich-Ideal. The echo of this thesis lingers in all 20th century theories, but at one point Rank notes something that has since ceased to play a role. In a reading that is strongly informed by cultural studies, Rank shows how two temporal layers overlap in the Don Juan material, the unconscious of the individual and the immemorial of the culture. With the term immemorial, unvordenklich, Hans-Georg Gadamer, who in turn takes it from Friedrich Schelling, addresses the repressed layers of human history. For this inaccessible layer, Freud invents the famous fairy tale of the primordial horde. It tells how, in the dim and distant past, the sons of the father who led the primal horde and to whom all the women belonged were guilty of a common crime. They murdered their father. Among the brothers, the master was the one who murdered the father alone and took his place and get all women for himself. As Rank shows, precisely such an idealization through heroization is at the basis of the Don Juan figure. Don Juan's guilt is not adipally motivated on the level of the individual, rather, in his guilt, the original guilt of the cultural imaginary breaks through. The artistic synthetic presentation of the Don Juan material culminates in Mozart's immortal masterpiece. Here the sense of guilt breaks through so powerful that it leads, on the one hand, to its clearest manifestation in the father complex, the commander, and on the other hand, to the complete inhibition of libido, which was originally unrestrained for the forbidden maternal object. The result of this second effect is that the whole series of women remains unattainable for the hero. This collision of the immemorial and the psychological charges the Don Juan figure with an energetic potential that has been unloaded in modern literature and theory since the mid-19th century. It is a source for the ambivalence of the master. So with Don Giovanni, Mozart produced a great monument to the master. In her ballad, Günderrode knocks it off its pedestal. In cases of such a hostile relationship, Harold Bloom speaks of misreading, which he assesses as a strategy of outdoing another author. However, Günderrode misreads not only Mozart, but also all Don Juan variations before and after her own poem. The ballad, Don Juan, has 22 cross-rhyme stanzas in iambic tetrameter, which each ends in a triple rhyme. They are divided into one group of 8 stanzas and 2 groups of 7 stanzas. Günderrode immediately violates all 4 variables of the tradition with her storyline. Don Juan desires only one woman. Don Juan does not have any rivals. Don Juan does not have a servant. Don Juan is not punished, at least not by the father. And the story that is narrated is also very different from those of Mozart and company, for the ballad tells of romantic love. This bourgeois concept had been promoted by European literature since the 1770s. It is Johann Wolfgang Goethe who, with the sorrows of young Werther, defines the prototype. This love is exclusive and combines heteronormative sex with the idea of soulmates. The fact that such a concept is not designed to last is a problem that modern novels revolve around. Basically, Günderrode interrupts the serial pattern of the Don Juan tradition by staging Juan's romantic love. Thereby, the love story represents the moment that each element in the series has and reveals the psychic economy, the economy of romantic love. It is a spectacular moment of union the ballad narratively unfolds by underlaying this moment with a story. The first part of the ballad tells of Don Juan's adoration of a queen. The second fantasizes a love story and the third is about the king's revenge. My analysis is based on narratological categories. So, in a narrative metalepsis, the narration jumps in the first verse from an extra-diegetic position outside the narrated world into the middle of the narrated world. It begins, now the festival has come, es ist der Festtag nun erschienen. Intradiegetically, the narrative is tied to a non-personalized position among the people. From out of the crowd and live on stage, the appearance of the beautiful queen alongside her new husband is enthusiastically cheered. The life effect is supported by the verb tenses in the present and perfect, a rhetorical technique of energia, vibrancy. The pair's wedding dance is watched in particular by one man, one in the crowd. Juan, who in turn is observed during this observation. Until the fifth stanza, he remains nameless, and the Don only appears in the title of the ballad. The second stanza introduces the two central concepts of the ballad, the gaze and the heart. In the 22 stanzas, the heart appears no less than 6 times as an organ of sensibility, Empfindsamkeit. The heart ages, but above all, in good patriarchal tradition, it burns for the queen, and it has done so for months, as the fourth stanza, which narrates the backstory of the wedding, makes clear. In the entire first part, the narrative follows Juan's gaze. It thus forfeits the autonomy that would characterize an extra-diegetic, heterodiegetic narrative. In other words, the ballad does not narrate about Juan, but rather with Juan. At the same time, the internal focalization is continuous, even in the passages that are not narrated in free indirect discourse or as a stream of consciousness. Nor does the mention of the name indicates that the narration is anchored outside the character's consciousness, because the internal focalization continues there. Pointedly, one could say, the nameless character interprets himself as Juan. We are thus plunged deeply and without escape into Juan's world. Thus he falls prey to his watching, and we fall with him. This is precisely the formal ingenuity of the ballad. It is not about Don Juan, which would alone make the deviation clear, but rather has a Don Juanian consciousness that is tied to a specific character. In this world, Juan has devoted himself to the adoration of a beautiful married woman, a woman he is separated from above all by social status. He is a nobody from the people, she the queen. Moreover, the lady is almost religiously transfigured, as in the tradition of Minnesang. The fifth stanza narrates how Don Juan disturbs the devotions of the courtly congregation on the Christian holiday of All Souls. In one scene, the queen even poses as the mother of God, first with her head lowered, then with her eyes turned heavenward. It is this transfiguration that stimulates Don Juan's desire. Then Juan's ardent gaze implored that she would just once make him happy. He imagines himself stepping in front of the altar. Aloud he'll tell her of his passion. Not the souls of the deceased are to be liberated, but his own. That's what he wants to demand. But it does not work. The attempt to realize the wish in reality does not result in a sovereign entrance, but rather in a crank talking crazy stuff in the crowd. So you have the quote here, and in English I quote in German. Laut spricht der Priester, lasset schweigen für Tote die Gebete all. Für mich lasst heiße Bitten steigen, denn größer ist der Liebe Qual, von der ich weniger kann genesen, als jene unglückseligen Wesen zur Qual des Feuers auserlesen. Here, an ambiguity of scope connects the torment of the purgatory with the torment caused by the flames of love, which form the imagery of the second and third part of the ballad. But Don Juan has only imagined his love. He has not revealed it to the courtly community, but to the crowd. And the latter is quite astonished that the expression of his feelings, as one reads in one of the few verses narrated without focalization in an ironic break in the scene. So where among the festive splendor, some quietly thinks, is she intended by his words, and with such fervor? Don Juan, a stalker, a poor lunatic, who covets his queen as a virgin and displays behavioral problems? That alone would be incredible, but Günderrode goes even further with her misreading. Graphically separated from the first 8 stanzas by a line, the next 7 stanzas introduce a change in the modality. Modality is an ontological category in narratology. We distinguished our actual world from possible and impossible other worlds. While the first 8 stanzas are epistemologically unreliable in that they are narrated with internal focalization, the events are nonetheless situated in the realm of the possible. The following 7 stanzas shift into the realm of the impossible. In other words, they switch from one narrated world into another. The trigger for this change, which is additionally motivated by a shift from the narrative to the dramatic mode, is the Queen's secret tears. Again, in free indirect discourse, Juan asks himself, was it pity, was it love that wrung those tears from me? The answer to the question initiates a veritable inner cinema, which is not located on the same ontological level as the events presented so far. What is fantasized is the fulfillment of exclusive romantic love in one day, indeed in a single hour. After that, Juan says he is ready. After that day, Juan says he is ready for the eternal death night. In this impossible world, Juan builds a theater for his beloved. It is this absurdity, a poor wretch from the people building a theater at lightning speed, that justifies my ontological interpretation. For this is the only way to explain how in God's name a theater can be built so quickly, pretty elaborate for one time of sex. Es liebt die Königin die Bühne, erschien oft selbst in buntem Spiel, dass dem kleinsten Wunsche diene, ist jetzt nur seines Lebens Ziel. Lässt ihr ein Theater bauen, dort will die reizendste der Frauen noch in neuer Anmut schauen. Der Hof sich einst im Spiel vereinet, die Königin in Schäferstracht, mit holder Anmut nun erscheinet, den Blumenkranz in Lockennacht, und Juans Seele sieht verwegen, mit ungestümen wildem Regen, dem kommenden Moment entgegen. Stanza 11 mixes the simple past, which refers to the possible world, with the present tense, in which the fantasy world is narrated, whereas in stanza 12, past and present overlap. That means the impossible world is an Juanian interpretation of the impossible world is a Juanian interpretation of the possible world. The modality of the impossible world, in which Juan's love is fulfilled, has a specific generic form. The ballad becomes an anachronistic ode, and I will spare you the details from analysis. What seems picturesque to us today, the queen donning the costume of a shepherdess, was a familiar code for sex in the era of Empfindsamkeit in the second half of 18th century, and is echoed in the peasant girl Selina, in the third woman in Mozart's Don Giovanni. So, an anachronistic porno is playing in rapid time-lapse in Don Juan's inner cinema. Because it is not possible, but rather impossible, it is not surprising that the theater, which has just been built, all of a sudden burns down again at Don Juan's signal. The fire renaturalizes the flame metaphors borrowed from the Petrarchan discourse of love. The burning theater and the flames of love alternate in the 13th and 14th stanzas. Winkt und Flamm und Dampf erfüllen entsetzlich jetzt das Schauspielhaus. Der liebe Glück will verhüllen in Dampf und Nacht und Schreck und Graus. Jauchzet, dass es ihm gelungen, des Schicksals Macht hat bezwungen. der Liebe süßen Lohn errungen. Gekommen ist die schöne Stunde, erträgt sie durch des Feuers Wut, raubt manchen Kuss dem schönen Munde, weckt ihres Busens tiefste Glut, möcht sterben jetzt in ihren Armen, möcht alles geben, ihr verarmen zu anderem Leben, sie erwarmen. The haunting literally comes to an end when the costume queen breaks free from the dream. This interruption unmasks the impossible world, not the ghost of the father, as in Shakespeare's Hamlet, but the ghost of the mother appears at the end of the scene. She sees her float through the halls, the minute's life is breathed out. Sieht sie durch die Hallen schweben, verhaucht ist der Minute Leben. Another line graphically separates the final 7 stanzas of the ballad from the middle 7 stanzas. Back in the possible world, things are looking bad for the romantic master-to-be. Juan suffers from crazed senses. The inner cinema, which plays in an impossible world, is thus psychologized in the postscript as a delusion. Around 1800, set pieces from the discourse of melancholy are available for representing madness. These set pieces are in turn stored in the communicative memory of the time through such influential texts as, again, Werther. Werther's sickness unto death is an integral part of the bourgeois concept of romantic love. In this last part, the ballad does change its stanzaic form. Through to the end, the cross-rhyming couplet is now followed by a rhyming couplet and a non-rhyming single verse. The very first single verse, emphasizes madness by addressing its media, her beloved, lovely image. This image of the queen rounds out the melancholic attributes that are compactly gathered together in the 16th and 17th stanzas to characterize Juan's madness. The waking dream state of madness, in which sleep and death are blended in the manner so typical of late Enlightenment psychological discourse, leads to a dissociated state in which Juan hears the voice of his grief and compares awakening from the episode to resurrection from a crypt. According to the International Classification of Diseases, Juan's condition would fulfill all symptoms of Schizophrenia. Und er erwacht aus seinem Schlummer, ist's ihm, als stieg er aus der Gruft, so fremd und tot, und aller Kummer, der mit ihm schlief, erwacht und ruft. So, erwacht und ruft means that he is listening to his own voice. O weine, sie ist dir verloren, die deine Liebe hat erkoren, ein Abgrund trennet sie und dich. And again, it seems as if something would happen in the ballad. In fact, however, nothing happens in the real world. For there is again a change in modality from the possible world to the impossible world, so the following action is also located on a different ontological level. Juan sets off for the gardens of the castle. There, if one believes the story, he meets a girl who gives him a letter from his beloved. In the letter, she tells him to save himself from the king, who, contrary to the Don Juan tradition, has no intention of being cuckolded or murdered. Juan reads the declarations of love, presses the page as a fetish to his heart, broods a little over his fate, and then, somewhat suddenly, falls victim to murder. While the impossible world of love has the generic form of an anachronistic ode, the impossible world of murder has the generic form of tragedy, but it is told both paradigmatically and at high tempo. So it's a very dense tragedy. The elements of secret love, the letter, and murder are paradigmatic. They are not narrated so much as simply recalled from communicative memory very quickly. That this tragedy also does not occur in reality, but merely in Juan's imagination, is made clear in the concluding verses, in which Juan lapses back into his dissociated state and repeats the anachronistic porno in his memory. Günderrode is a well-educated author. Around 1800, everybody knows which tragedy she's quoting. It is Friedrich Schiller's dramatic poem Don Carlos, Infant of Spain, which was published in 1787, the same year that Mozart opera premiered. That is the last point of my talk, which needs a little more background, so you have to wait a little while for Schiller. Allow me briefly to summarize again. Both love and punishment, the two central Don Juan motives, are narrated but do not take place. For Günderrode combined the techniques of internal focalization, which had become increasingly common since the end of the 18th century, with a sophisticated change of modality. The only real thing is Juan's romantic love. In an infantile tendency to regress, Juan in The Queen idealizes the image of a mother according to the Mariological model, so as then only to sexualize it. To sexualize it according to the anachronistic model and to be punished for it according to the tragic model. All of this is an expression of dissociation. Yet it is precisely the anachronistic costuming of the Mother of God that points to the phenomenon that Berndt describes using the example of Mozart, a phenomenon that is quite typical of literature around 1800, the superimposition of temporal layers. When Juan worships and desires the Queen, he worships and desires her individually as a mother and culturally as an archaic great mother, like a magna mater. This mother imago is mediated by the staging common in anachronistic poetry of the shepherdess as Hebe, the Greek goddess of youth and the wife of Heracles. Through a series of connections in the mythological sources with the goddesses Hera, Aphrodite, and Artemis, Hebe ultimately refers to the chthonic maternal goddesses of an archaic matriarchal cultural stage. In his 1861 cultural anthropological study Mother Right, Johann Jakob Bachhofen distinguishes between an earliest heteric mother, a matriarchal oral mother, and a patriarchal Oedipal mother. Juan's supremely powerful mother imago is characterized by the fact that she combines all three mother imaginis. She has sexual, nurturing, and punitive aspects. This mother imago thus also has an Oedipal function. In the ballad, the king is accordingly not Juan's murderer, rather the murder is narrated in an entirely indeterminate manner. A killing dagger finds his breast. Da trifft ein Mörderdolch die Brust. And nobody knows where it comes from, right? The symbolic order of the ballad, in which we are not released from Juan's view of the world until the very end, thus represents, to use Gilles Deleuze's term, an intermaternal order. The penultimate stanza, in the penultimate stanza, the two rhetorical questions framing an exclamation refer to the three functions of the mother imago. This is supported by the impure rhyme meiden und bereiten. Liest das Blatt mit leisem Beben und liebt's und drückt es an sein Herz. Gewaltsam teilet sich sein Leben in große Wonne, tiefen Schmerz. Sollt die Teuerste nun meiden? Kann sie dies Trauern ihm bereiten? Soll sie immer wiedersehen? The actual vanishing point is not sexual union with the shepherdess, as Juan recalls it in Dying with the repeated rhyming words Stunde Munde, but the imagination of death as sleep. The ballad establishes the pictorial connection between madness, slumber, and death already in the 17th stanza in the image of the crypt. The figura etymologica schlummer schlummer now repeats this connection in the last stanza and assigns it to the mother imago. Rank, by the way, also notices the chthonic maternal symbolism of the crypt in Mozart's Don Giovanni. geht nun, wie sie ihm geboten, da trifft ein Mörderdolch die Brust, doch steigt er freudig zu den Toten, denn der Erinnerung süße Lust ruft ihm herauf die schönste Stunde, er hänget noch an ihrem Munde, entschlummert sanft in ihrem Arm. The imago is omnipresent in the communicative memory around 1800. For example, in his famous drawing, the classicist painter Asmus Jakob Carstens links individual psychological regression with pagan and Christian mythology. In this drawing, he depicts the chthonic maternal goddess of the night. Nyx is the mother of Hypnos, the god of sleep, and of Thanatos, the god of gentle death. This scene also reflects the type of the Virgin of Mercy with a protective mantle from the Christian iconography. By superimposing the unconscious of the individual and the immemorial of culture, Günderrode stages a regressive Juan who imagines a pre-Oedipal world in which there's not yet a father. Rank also notices this potential of the Don Juan figure and elaborates on it. As a fantasy also clearly reveals, this unattainability does not refer to sexual possession, to which there is certainly no barrier in primitive times and character. Rather, it involves the deeply rooted biological wish for the exclusive and complete possession of the mother, as once experienced in the pleasure of the prenatal situation and forever afterward sought as the highest libidinal satisfaction. The unreliable narration in the ballad thus leads not into a heroic world, but into a pre-Oedipal one. The real point here is that Günderrode's ballad has, not least because of its serious deviations from the tradition, an explicit intertextual relationship to the greatest tragedy of German classicism, and here Schiller's tragedy finally comes into play. For in her ballad, Günderrode overlays Don Juan with Dom Carlos. There it is King Philip II of Spain who marries his son's mistress, Elizabeth of Valois. This Philip is mentioned by name in the fifth stanza. It is amazing that no one has noted this before. But if Philip is the husband of the adored and coveted queen, then Juan's position is precarious. He is the rival of the master. Juan can either take the position of John of Austria, who was the half-brother of King Philip. That is the alternative which would come into play with Shakespeare. And that looking for sources is like a game in literary studies. I don't know why they play it, but they like it. So I do it. Okay, that was one guy, John of Austria, the other. Or, and that is the alternative, I prefer, he takes the position of Carlos of Austria, who was the son of King Philip, an infant of Spain. Actually, it doesn't really matter, because John of Austria and Carlos of Austria are both of the same age. That means symbolically both are sons of the father. Günderrode, however, squints at Schiller with evil eye. Don Carlos desires his former fiancée Queen Elizabeth of Valois after her marriage to King Philip in the symbolic position of mother, and that is the hero's tragic flaw. And it establishes the Oedipal conflict with Philip. Although he is willing to replace his love for Elizabeth with a sublimated love for his fatherland, Carlos is handed over to the Inquisition at the end of the tragedy by his jealous, vengeful father. It is precisely this altruism of a wannabe master that Günderrode deconstructs. When Carlos becomes Juan, it is not because he wages a heroic struggle against his ego ideal, Ich-Ideal, and is thus identified with the father. Rather, the ballad de-heroizes Juan and banishes the father from the scene, which is dominated by Juan's pre-Oedipal consciousness and an overpowering mother imago corresponding to this consciousness. Juan Carlos can thus neither be a potential and powerful master. Not only is he not the dick that picks up all the chicks, he actually is the one without any dick at all. This is the crux of Günderrode's talking back to the myth of the master. Thus, at the end of the ballad, she literally draws a line under the tribute of the concept of master, which her contemporary Hegel, as well as German classicists, worship. No matter which sick king's son is idealized, Goethe's Faust, Schiller's Carlos, or whatever they may be called, and Hegel's as such named master, they all testify not to power, but to the powerlessness of a male consciousness that remains regressively attached to the mother. So in the end, all that remains for us to do is to correct the title of Günderrode's ballad. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Frauke. That was rich and pointing in different directions, at least for me. We are going in the pre-Oedipal way. Do you have any questions concerning the presentation? I think it somehow relates to our contemporary new, or whatever you call them, ridiculous, creepy, whatever, masters. It goes in the way that once was described by Deleuze in his book, The Difference and Repetition, that our task today would perhaps be to present different Hegel in different Marx. So Marx without beard and Hegel with a beard. So this is Don Juan without a dick, in a way. And as far as I could follow, there are some very interesting points to attach to. So,
I was more inspired by Deleuze's interpretation of Sacher Masoch, Venus in Fur, and the whole concept of masochism. Yeah, that's always a problem with reading literature. Nobody wants to read literature. I have to do the tapas thing, actually.
Yeah.
Thank you, that was really interesting. Would Lord Byron have been aware of Günderrode when he wrote Don Juan?
I don't think so.
No, because it seems that Don Juan is, a very similar kind of, not a sick master, but a weak master. He's this permanently put upon, boyish figure, he's not the world-weary libertine of legend.
Exactly.
And there's a kind of infinite repetition in Don Juan, and that it could just go on forever. Yeah. In the same way. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, actually, all the literary staging of that master figures, when they go along with the Don Juan Passepartout, so to speak, they are weak, and I think that would be actually my point. And so my maybe overall point would be we're talking about the master as if it is unquestionable that he has authority, that he is struggling in the dialectics and so on and so forth. And I'm really more interested in the like dark side concepts of master, and you definitely find them even in Mozart or definitely in Günderrode, definitely in Byron, and there's a huge there's just much intertextuality on Don Juan. He's like always in 19th century. And that is one point. And the other thing, if the master has a Don Juanian layer and can be considered as a regressive concept, and that would be my claim. So first I was thinking about that Günderrode kind of castrates the master. Then how can it be that we deal with the concept without questioning its ideological roots on one hand, and on the other hand, it's like problematic aspects, or let's say psychological abyss, or so for me it never makes so much sense to work with concept without looking what is the problem of that concept? Where does it come from? Which energy do I need to charge it? And what if I charge it? What other problems then occur with that process? And I know that you guys are basically interested in political theory. It's perfectly fine. I am too, but I think it's worth looking that even with that interest, we always come along with that problematic aspect, as I said in the beginning. So we have him ridiculous, hysterical, excessive, undead, colonial, racist, traumatized, and castrated, and creepy. I forgot creepy. And I think that's remarkable, and that's something I would really suggest to integrate in our theoretical discussion. That was basically my point.
Okay, thank you. I think Gregor, and then Yuval and Anka. I don't know.
Frauke, thank you. This was very interesting. I kind of liked this poem. I'm completely unaware of it, so I'm not able to comment on your interpretation or your reading. I was just fascinated by the. I'll have to read it properly by myself in my solitary studio, whatever. But I really like the idea of going for. Maybe this was in the background. I don't know. This is, I suppose, a question I would ask you, like love as the master. This is kind of like a motif from ancient times. You'll have, amor vincit omnia from Virgilius. Amor being the god that defeats all other gods, basically. And you have the same myth in Symposium by Plato, not by Socrates, but I think someone else makes this same kind of point of Eros being the god who defeats all other gods, basically, the master god. So I don't know. This is. I know that your interpretation goes in a very different direction at all, but like this, I don't know. How do you see love in relationship to?
I'm not so fond of love.
But I mean, this is romantic. This is. I mean, nevertheless, this is romantic oder verromantic, oder?
Well, romantic love is like an ideological problem, I would say. Actually, what you suggest, two things. First, I don't think that it helps to identify the concept of master with other concepts. That does not help. It might help to contextualize the concept of master within the discourses the concept is used into, or with the with like parallel discourses like literature, because in literature, as I said, dark sides are revealed. The concept of love is always a highly problematic concept, and it's invented actually to keep bourgeois capitalism ongoing, because it's a pragmatic concept. And I mean, the good thing about love, if we hadn't love, we would not have that great novels of 19th century, right? Madame Bovary, Anna Karenina, and so on and so forth, because love just does not work. It's pure ideology, and if the master was love, I would rather run.
Yuval.
All right. Thank you so much. You gave such a granular talk that I really apologize that my question is somehow general and doesn't engage with that level. And it's really a kind of a honest, naive question. There's this, I don't know if it's real trivia or fake trivia, it doesn't matter, but it's often said that what women fear about men most is that they'll kill them or hurt them, physically, and what men fear about women most is that they'll ridicule them, right?
Yeah.
You've heard this. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I heard that.
It's like statistically true, but it rings true. And what I want to really sort of ask you is, what does this do to the relation between power and potency, right? Because, I mean, there are all kinds of complications around that. Clearly, we can imagine there are not few cases of violence against women that have that as a motive behind them, or that fear behind them, right? To be exposed, to be precisely revealed as dickless, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, so, I mean, it just, how do you think of those power dynamics in sense of in terms of this critique of the sickness of the master.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, female authors around 1800 they had a hard time, right? And Günderrode, she was a mistress of one of that philologists, classicists. His name was Friedrich Kreutzer, and he actually dropped her because he got sick, and then his wife would say, "Okay, I take care for you. I don't take care for you unless you separate from your mistress," which was Karoline von Güderrode. And if you want to read it biographically, which I never do, but as a thought play, I would say, well, it's a nice way of taking revenge to Schiller, Goethe, and co. And that would include the whole crowd of German idealists and romanticists, and just castrate Don Juan in public, right, and make him dickless, as you said. That would be a nice and pretty funny and convincing biographical interpretation of that motive. But I think so Günderrode is it's paradigmatic. So I took this poem because first I wanted to choose a female author. Second, I wanted to have a contemporary of Hegel. In order to show you that there are two qualities of discourse: the philosophical, conceptual one, and then the literary one which uses images. And the logic of images is obviously completely different from the work on the concept of master. However, I think that and now I repeat myself, we see the master as a concept of exclusions, and that is what was for me very present the last 2 days. So in the concept of master excludes basically every person who is not male, white, heterosexual, powerful, what else? Old. Yeah. And so in a way I see the erotic of concepts clearly. I mean, in my real life I work on 18th century aesthetics, which is only about concepts. But I see the danger of taking concepts too seriously. So, for example, yesterday evening there was the discussion in Slavoj's talk: do we need masters? I think, God, no, we don't, right? And the idea is, how can you say, God, no, I don't need masters, I don't even want masters, and masters are the evil of everything, right? So why don't we look into other discourse formations in order to see the problematic aspect of an interesting historical concept in order to kind of either overcome it completely or to correct it. So there's not even a female word, a female word for master. You could not say mistress, because mistress is highly ambivalent. Mistress is like the beloved and the female part of master. I mean, so
you forgot domina.
Yeah, domina. Well, yeah, but master and domina, yeah, exactly. So if a female master, you have to have a domina. I mean, yes, and that is terrible as well, right? So, yeah, that was what came across my mind.
Just to interrupt the questions, my colleague Aleš Bunter wrote a piece on rise of masochism.
Yeah, so, I like masochism.
Yeah. He wrote it from the perspective of Deleuze and the practices, and he's kind of a connoisseur. So, Anka.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. You've already started answering what I wanted to ask you, but I'll ask it anyway. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I've never heard of Günderrode, right? And I've never heard of Karoline von Güderrode, right? And I've heard of almost everyone else you mentioned, right? So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the question of the canon and how canons and relate to authority, right?
What?
That's on the one hand, right? How to think about, methodologically about what you're trying to achieve by invoking this poem and placing it in the context in which you did, right? Is the idea that your very careful reading is recuperating Günderrode and presumably inserting her into the canon? And what is that doing to the question of the canon's authority? Right.
Oh,
That's one question. But the other one has to do with a kind of hierarchy of canons we have between literary canons and the philosophical canons, and how those are gendered. So on the one hand, we have like a philosophical canon that's clearly masculine, right? With perhaps Hegel at its center, and then the literary canon kind of, somewhere coming after it, right?
Yes.
Yes. So two questions there about canons, and then about kind of different kinds of canons.
Yeah, thank you. They are great. Well, yes. I mean, with canon, it's like with love, right? So canon.
Don't like it.
So in this case, I don't need actually to reintegrate her, Karoline von Güderrode, into the canon. She is kind of into it. She even has collected works. She's like a random figure, but not so random. And well, yes, of course. I mean that I choose her and not. I could have given the same talk basically on Mozart. But yes, it's kind of nice because she's about the same age as Hegel, so I think it's really nice to pair them, right? And she came into the canon very late. I think it was, I don't even know. I'm so bad in that thing. So history is not so my strength. But the other thing is more interesting, I think. So canon, okay, and she is into it, and now even more, hopefully. Now she's at least into the master's canon. That's good. The other thing is more like really a personal thing, a conviction, so to speak. I'm an educated philosopher, so I know how to work with concepts, and I do that extensively. But I think that literature is, and that is what I always say, it's a media of knowledge, and by that, every literary text is an epistemic object. And in some, whatever you want to know from life or from ideas or what's going on in specific episteme, you find different answers in literature than in philosophical texts. So if I had the choice, I mean, well, I think that I would go for literature because it's more fun, and the good thing is you're not guided. So if I'm kind of a scholar in Baumgarten, who is a Latin philosopher and very boring, and it needs a while, like a couple of years, until you even can talk about him, right? And if you talk about him, you're like in Hegel, and you can see that in our round here, you are very much into the system, and it needs a lot of strength to get out of the system of the philosopher, where a literary text doesn't guide you, it leaves you completely alone. So if you don't have questions, you don't find answers, right? And so that is the I would say that is a privilege of art in general, that it has more and probably richer answers, because it does not prefigure questions. So it's a very, I think reading is a very creative process, and I was really listening to Henrik and to the tapas model of reading literature. You can't read in little pieces, right? You have to get engaged into art, and you have to know something. You have to be able to describe in order to see something. So I go for literature if I had to make a decision. What is the major discourse? Of course it's philosophy, but for me it's not anymore, or only sometimes.
Okay, the last question, Marisa.
Well, I just have a very quick comment. I find it interesting in the fact that the man that you showed us on the paintings, probably both, but at least at one I noticed, one was showing a very protruding codpiece between his legs.
I noticed that too.
Yeah, when you see it, it's like it's in your face.
John, somewhat.
They're all John. That's the problem one.
So I mean, like, I find this piece of clothing very interesting. I mean, it was very popular, especially in the 16th century. I mean, it was meant to cover the crotch of a man, but also to enhance it. If I remember correctly, at some point it became very, very popular to make it bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think there is a play at present, like a play of hiding and showing off at the same time. Literally, they're showing their masculinity, their mastery on one hand, but on the other, it comes across as a sort of castrating object, as a cage. I find it played very well with your analysis.
Yeah, this one is really great. I mean, the interesting thing is that this guy has kind of two dicks, right? Because it's the little one in the middle, and then he has got the symbolical one, which is actually the real one, right? So, and that staging of Martha, that would be a completely different talk. But I would like to, I would definitely think about that. Yeah. And again, I think that is what you've been asking. There is something of there is an aggressive potential in that ballad, definitely, and my working title was always about castration, because the reduction actually of the master topic to the dialectic between a penis and phallus. I think that is really compelling in that ballad, and we had to think about that. So how much phallus is Martha the phallus, and how much penis does he need, or something like that? Yeah, so in this direction. I always love pictures. I love them actually more than text. Did I forget to say that?
Yeah. We can give applause to Frauke. Thank you.